He had no idea that one small act would change both of their lives forever. The rain was falling steadily on the streets of downtown New York, turning the sidewalks into slick mirrors reflecting the neon lights from the surrounding shops and street signs. Ethan Miller, a 28-year-old taxi driver with a worn green jacket and a tired expression etched across his face, steered his yellow cab carefully through puddles that splashed against the tires. He was on his last fare of the night, hoping to make it home before the city felt any colder than it already did. The air was sharp and biting, and his fingers were stiff from gripping the wheel for hours. Suddenly, through the rain-soaked haze, he noticed a woman shivering near the curb, her coat thin and inadequate against the chill, her high heels sinking slightly into the wet pavement. Without a second thought, he pulled over and rolled down the window. She looked up, startled, her dark hair plastered against her forehead, her eyes wide with an almost fragile vulnerability. Ethan called out, "Would you like a ride? It is no trouble at all." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, grateful beyond words, and climbed into the back seat, the warmth of the cab a stark contrast to the cold she had been enduring. As he drove, Ethan made small talk. Learning her name was Victoria, though he noticed she was hesitant to reveal too much. Her voice was soft, tinged with fatigue, and every now and then she would glance out the window, lost in thought. Ethan did not know, and could not have imagined, that Victoria Hale was the billionaire owner of the transportation company for which he worked, a fact that would turn his world upside down. The cab radio played a low hum in the background, mingling with the sound of rain against the roof, creating a rhythm that matched the quiet tension of the ride. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ethan tried to focus on the route, yet his mind wandered to his own struggles, the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, the rent due in less than a week, and the thought of finally offering kindness to a stranger, no matter the cost, filled him with a curious mix of pride and apprehension that clung to his skin like a shadow. He wondered if acts of kindness really made a difference in the world, and whether he had done the right thing by letting her ride for free. As he prepared a small bowl of instant oatmeal, the only thing he had left to eat for the evening, he replayed the ride in his mind, the soft sound of the rain tapping against the windshield, the hum of the cab, and the way she had thanked him, a hint of warmth and relief in her voice that had made his chest tighten. Meanwhile, Victoria stepped into the elevator of her high-rise apartment. The contrast between the streets she had just left and the polished marble of her building stark and jarring. She shook off the residual wetness from her coat and let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it. Her mind kept returning to the driver, his face lined with fatigue, his small act of generosity in a world that often demanded more than people could give. She had witnessed many people who expected reward or recognition for kindness. Yet here was someone who had acted purely out of instinct, without hesitation or expectation. The memory of his eyes, the soft brown that had held a mixture of curiosity and concern, lingered in her thoughts. She placed her coat on the hanger and walked to her office within the apartment, a small private study that she reserved for thinking and planning. Her fingers brushed over a small leather notebook she carried with her everywhere, and she wrote a few lines about the encounter, noting the way the world sometimes offered moments of grace that reminded her why she had worked so hard to build her company from the ground up. Victoria thought about how she could find this driver again, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity and a need to understand what had compelled him to act with such selflessness. The city outside her window glimmered with lights reflecting off the damp streets, and she felt a peculiar sense of anticipation, as though something significant had just begun, even if neither of them realized it yet. Ethan, on the other side of the city, finished his small meal and laid down on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the woman in the back of his cab once more. He wondered what her life was like, and if someone like her could ever see the worth in a man like him. Sleep was slow to come, his mind spinning with questions and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, his simple act of kindness would ripple far beyond that rainy night. The morning sun had just begun to peek over the skyline, casting a pale gold light across the wet streets of the city as Ethan Miller climbed into his taxi, for another long day of driving. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them against the chill that lingered from the night before. The meter ticked steadily as he picked up fares, each one a small reminder of the endless hours he spent behind the wheel just to keep his small apartment and pay the bills stacked on the counter at home. Today was no different. Yet in the back of his mind lingered the memory of Victoria Hale, the woman he had given a ride to in the rain. He could not shake the image of her shivering hands, the way her coat hung loosely, and the soft, almost hesitant gratitude in her voice. As he drove, he noticed the city moving with its usual rhythm, people hurrying along the sidewalks, umbrellas bobbing like colorful mushrooms in the morning mist, cars honking as they tried to navigate the slick streets. Each stoplight and turn reminded him of the fleeting nature of human connection and how one small act could ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Despite the monotony of his work, Ethan kept replaying the encounter in his mind, analyzing his own motives, wondering if his kindness had meant anything at all. He thought about how easy it would have been to ignore her, to focus on the fare and the drive home. Yet he had acted without expectation, a rare impulse of compassion in a world that often rewarded self-interest. Meanwhile, Victoria had returned to her office in the headquarters of Hale Transport, a building that rose proudly above the surrounding city blocks, gleaming glass reflecting the sunlight. She stepped into her private suite, the quiet hum of the elevators and the distant sounds of traffic below, creating a strange sense of isolation. Her assistant, a young man with neatly combed hair named Daniel, watched as she removed her damp coat and hung it carefully on the stand. Victoria paused, staring at the floor as she remembered the driver, his eyes tired but kind, his expression sincere in a way that defied the wealth and power she was accustomed to witnessing every day. She considered the improbability of their encounter, a momentary collision of two worlds that rarely intersected. With a deep breath, she pulled a small leather notebook from her bag, jotting down a few notes about the man who had shown her unexpected generosity, detailing his appearance, the cab he drove, and the quiet dignity in his actions. She wondered how she might find him again, not for her own amusement, but out of a genuine curiosity to understand the character of someone who acted so purely without expectation of reward. Back on the streets, Ethan stopped briefly to refuel at a gas station, the scent of gasoline and asphalt filling his senses. He noticed a small group of children playing in the puddles nearby, laughing despite the cold, and he felt a pang of empathy thinking about how much the world relied on simple acts of care and attention. As he returned to the road, picking up another fare, he felt the weight of his own life pressing in. Yet there was also a strange lightness in the memory of the previous night, a reminder that even in exhaustion and struggle, there were moments that could touch the soul. Every turn of the wheel, every fare picked up, seemed to echo the lesson he had learned, that kindness could emerge in the most ordinary circumstances, and that the consequences of a single compassionate decision could unfold in ways he could not yet imagine. The city stretched out before him, a mosaic of glass, concrete, and fleeting moments of human connection, and Ethan drove on, unaware that his small act of generosity was already beginning to change the course of both his life and the life of the woman who had accepted his ride. Victoria Hale stepped into her private apartment suite, the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers mingling with the faint aroma of her morning coffee. She closed the door softly behind her, letting the sound of the city fade into a distant hum. The apartment was spacious, yet every piece of furniture, every carefully selected decoration, reflected her meticulous attention to detail and the success she had built over the years. She removed her damp coat and laid it over the back of a chair, her fingers brushing over the leather notebook she always carried. Inside, she had written notes about the taxi driver, Ethan Miller, capturing the way he had shown kindness without hesitation, the warmth in his eyes despite exhaustion, and the genuine concern that had radiated from him during their short ride. She had never been impressed by wealth alone, nor did she often find herself thinking about strangers. Yet something about Ethan lingered in her mind, a quiet curiosity that refused to fade. As she brewed another cup of coffee, she recalled the moment when he had insisted she take the ride, despite the cost to himself. She wondered about his life, the struggles he faced, and the small victories and defeats that shaped his day-to-day existence. Meanwhile, Ethan Miller finished his last fare for the morning and returned to his modest apartment, the sunlight streaming through the narrow windows and casting patterns on the cracked linoleum floor. He carefully organized his few belongings, noting the stack of overdue bills on the counter and the small pile of unpaid receipts that reminded him of the precarious balance between survival and exhaustion. The memory of Victoria's presence, her hands trembling slightly from the cold, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude, stayed with him. He found himself smiling faintly, realizing that he could not stop thinking about the brief encounter, and a flicker of hope stirred within him. Despite the monotony of his life, the long hours behind the wheel, and the constant pressure to make ends meet, this single act of kindness had left an imprint on him that he could not ignore. Victoria, settling into her chair by the window, allowed herself to gaze at the streets below, watching pedestrians hurrying along the wet sidewalks, umbrellas opening and closing like petals in the wind. She thought about the thousands of people she interacted with daily, the board meetings, the endless decisions, and yet the image of the tired taxi driver who had given her warmth without question remained the most vivid. She traced a finger over the page in her notebook, wondering if she could ever find him again. Not for charity, not for business, but out of an intrinsic desire to understand the man behind the act. At the same time, Ethan prepared a quick breakfast, reheating leftover eggs and toast while glancing at the clock, knowing he had to return to the streets. He considered the fleeting nature of connections in the city, how one chance encounter could ripple quietly through a life, leaving an invisible mark. The hum of traffic outside reminded him that the world moved on, indifferent to small gestures. Yet he clung to the memory of Victoria's expression, the way she had seemed both grateful and startled by his choice. Neither of them could yet foresee the ways in which this moment would intertwine their lives, nor the challenges and revelations that awaited as the day unfolded. As Ethan grabbed his keys and stepped out into the crisp morning air, he inhaled deeply, feeling a sense of resolve mixed with anticipation, unaware that Victoria was already planning how she might find him again, and that the city itself seemed to hold its breath for the paths of these two lives to cross once more. Victoria could not stop thinking about the taxi driver, Ethan Miller, whose simple act of kindness had left such a strong impression on her. She paced slowly across her office, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished oak floors and the neat stacks of papers and reports on her desk. Her mind kept returning to the way he had insisted she take the ride despite the cold rain, how his hands had gripped the steering wheel with a combination of fatigue and focus, and the quiet dignity in his voice that made her feel unexpectedly safe. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant, Daniel, asking him to help track down the cab number and license plate from the previous evening. Daniel raised an eyebrow, knowing that Victoria rarely involved herself in something so personal, but he complied, tapping away on his tablet to search through the records from the dispatch center. Meanwhile, Ethan maneuvered his taxi through the busy streets, the traffic thick with delivery trucks and morning commuters, the sunlight reflecting off the windshield making it difficult to see at times. He thought about the note Victoria had accidentally left behind in his cab, a small folded piece of stationery that had slipped from her bag as she had exited. He had tucked into the glove compartment, curious but unsure of what to do with it. The note was simple, just a few lines of handwriting expressing thanks, yet it carried a warmth that made him smile quietly to himself as he drove past the familiar buildings of the city. At the same time, Victoria had arrived at the dispatch center, reviewing the CCTV footage with Daniel, scanning each cab that had been in the area the night before. The camera angles were not perfect, but she caught a glimpse of Ethan's face, the tired but kind expression that matched her memory exactly. Her heart quickened with anticipation as she made the decision to find him, not as a CEO interacting with a subordinate, but as someone who was genuinely curious to meet the person who had acted without expectation or hesitation. Back in his small apartment, Ethan had just finished cleaning up the remnants of a quick breakfast and was preparing to head out for his morning shift. The city outside was alive with the sounds of horns, footsteps, and distant sirens, yet there was a quiet rhythm to his life that he had grown accustomed to, punctuated by moments like the one from the night before that reminded him of human connection. As he pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, he noticed a flash of movement from a nearby street and instinctively slowed the car, expecting another pedestrian to cross in the busy morning traffic. It was then that he saw a familiar figure approaching across the sidewalk, a woman in a professional coat, her hair still slightly damp from the morning mist, her eyes scanning the street until they landed on him. Victoria's approach was deliberate yet measured, and when she reached the cab, she paused, taking a deep breath before speaking. Ethan stopped the engine, heart skipping a beat as she looked directly at him, her presence commanding yet strangely vulnerable, and he realized instantly that this was the same woman from the rain-soaked night. Victoria smiled softly, extending her hand and introducing herself properly, her voice calm and genuine, explaining that she had wanted to find him ever since that ride, to express her gratitude and to discuss an opportunity to work on a community initiative she was leading. Ethan's mind raced, trying to reconcile the idea that this woman, poised and confident, could remember him, seek him out, and offer such a proposition. He felt a mixture of disbelief, pride, and nervous anticipation, realizing that his life was about to take a turn in ways he could not yet comprehend. Victoria continued, sharing small details about her project, emphasizing that she had seen something in him during that brief encounter, a quality of compassion and integrity that she hoped he could bring to the team. Ethan nodded slowly, listening intently, the morning sun casting warm rays on the cab and the wet streets around them, the city alive with possibility and promise. As the two stood there in the quiet hum of the urban morning, the encounter that began as a simple ride through rain now unfolding into the first step of a journey that would intertwine their lives more deeply than either could have imagined. The parking lot was quiet, a soft haze of morning mist clinging to the asphalt as Ethan Miller stood beside his taxi, gripping the steering wheel and taking a deep breath to calm the mix of nerves and excitement swirling inside him. He had agreed to meet Victoria Hale here, at the edge of the city, where the early sunlight filtered through the sparse trees and cast long shadows across the lot. As he waited, he adjusted his worn jacket and ran his fingers through his hair, trying to steady himself, wondering if this encounter would feel as natural as their previous one, or if it would be awkward under the weight of the opportunity she had offered. A few moments later, Victoria approached, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement, a leather folder tucked under her arm, the morning light catching the strands of her dark hair as she smiled warmly at him. Ethan felt a flicker of uncertainty, unsure whether to shake her hand or simply nod, and Victoria, sensing his hesitation, spoke first, her voice calm, yet inviting. "I am so glad you agreed to meet me here." She gestured toward the empty parking spaces, the quiet of the area providing a neutral ground where neither of them felt constrained by the city or the workplace. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard, and returned a small smile. "Thank you for reaching out. I was not expecting to see you again so soon," yet a part of him felt that this moment had been building from a night he had offered her the ride in. The rain. They began walking slowly toward the far side of the lot, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty space, and Victoria carried on, explaining that she wanted to show him a project she was overseeing, one that involved outreach to drivers and employees who worked long hours in the city but rarely felt recognized for their efforts. Ethan listened, intrigued, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he realized that this was not about charity or patronage, but about genuine collaboration. As they reached a small covered area near the edge of the lot, Victoria opened her leather folder and began laying out plans and diagrams, showing Ethan how the program was designed to provide resources, support, and recognition for drivers like him. She spoke with passion, her eyes lighting up as she described the impact the initiative could have on the lives of countless people, and Ethan found himself drawn into her vision, imagining how he could contribute and make a difference. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by occasional laughter as Victoria shared anecdotes about past projects and lessons learned, and Ethan began to feel a sense of ease that he had not anticipated, a rare connection forming between them that transcended the roles of driver and CEO. At one point, Victoria paused and looked directly at him. Her eyes softened, and she said, "Ethan, I saw something in you the night I got into your cab, a quality that cannot be taught or bought, a willingness to act with compassion even when it is inconvenient." Ethan felt his chest tighten, a mix of pride and humility swelling within him, and he struggled to find words that would express the gratitude and surprise he felt. He realized that this encounter, simple as it began, was shaping into something far more significant, a moment where his actions had been noticed, valued, and could lead to new possibilities he had never imagined. The morning sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow across the lot, and the city began to stir in the distance, the sounds of traffic and distant voices blending into a gentle hum. Ethan and Victoria continued to talk, their conversation weaving between practical details of the project and small personal anecdotes, creating a bridge of understanding and trust that neither had anticipated but both recognized as meaningful. The air was crisp and filled with promise, and as they concluded their meeting, Ethan felt a sense of anticipation for the days ahead, knowing that this simple encounter in the misty parking lot was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge and transform both of their lives, forging a connection built on respect, kindness, and the shared hope of making a difference. Victoria Hale paused outside a sleek modern building, the glass panels reflecting the mid-morning sun and the bustling streets below. She adjusted the leather folder under her arm and took a deep breath before pressing the doorbell for the secure entrance, knowing that the next few minutes would change the dynamic between her and Ethan Miller in ways neither could have anticipated. Inside, the elevator hummed quietly as it carried her to the executive floor, where the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. Ethan was waiting near the reception area, his posture straight but slightly tense, his eyes flicking to her as she approached. He had dressed neatly, wearing a collared shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, and the subtle apprehension in his expression did not escape Victoria. She smiled softly, walking toward him and extending her hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I want you to meet the team and see firsthand the work we are doing with the community project," she said, her voice calm, but carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire. Ethan nodded, swallowing his nervousness, feeling both honored and overwhelmed by the transition from streets, filled with rain and cab fares, to this pristine corporate environment. They walked together through a corridor lined with large framed photographs of past projects and charitable initiatives, each one a testament to the scale of the company and Victoria's influence. Ethan could not help but notice the contrast between his world and hers, the meticulous organization, the quiet efficiency, and the polished floors that seemed to amplify the soft clicking of their shoes. Victoria led him into a conference room where several members of her executive team were waiting, and introductions were made with a mixture of professional courtesy and subtle curiosity. Ethan could feel the weight of their attention, the careful observation as they assessed his presence and demeanor, and he reminded himself to breathe slowly and focus on the purpose of this meeting. Victoria guided him to a seat near the head of the table and began explaining the logistics of the community initiative, detailing how taxi drivers and other employees who often worked long hours and faced financial pressures could receive additional support, resources, and recognition through structured programs. Ethan listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own experiences from the streets, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. The executives exchanged impressed glances, noting the practical insight he brought, and Victoria's eyes sparkled with approval at his observations. As the meeting progressed, Ethan began to realize the magnitude of the opportunity before him, that his experience and empathy could directly influence the design and implementation of a program that would improve the lives of countless workers. Victoria noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor, the gradual confidence replacing uncertainty, and she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction in seeing someone rise to the occasion. Later, As the meeting concluded, she walked alongside him toward the exit, the sunlight streaming through the glass panels warming the cool interior. Ethan felt a mixture of awe and gratitude, understanding that the woman who had once been a stranger in his back seat had now entrusted him with responsibility and respect in her professional world. They paused briefly by the elevator, and Victoria placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Ethan, I want you to know that your integrity and your willingness to help without expectation is exactly what we need," she said softly, and the words resonated deeply, leaving Ethan momentarily speechless. Programs for drivers and employees who often went unnoticed despite their hard work. Ethan listened intently, feeling a mixture of excitement and self-doubt. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness would lead to something so significant. Yet here he was, being asked to contribute his perspective to a program that could positively affect the lives of many. As they entered a conference room filled with charts, schedules, and folders neatly arranged on the table, Victoria gestured for Ethan to take a seat. Had never been in a position of influence like this, and yet he trusted Victoria's guidance, recognizing that her offer was both a challenge and an opportunity. Walking through the streets together, they stopped at various locations where drivers took breaks or picked up fares. Ethan introduced Victoria to colleagues, and she observed, noting the interactions, listening, and asking thoughtful questions. The experience highlighted the contrast between his daily routine and the structured corporate world she managed. Yet it also underscored the potential for bridging these worlds through thoughtful programs and compassionate leadership. By the end of the day, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment and belonging that he had not anticipated, and Victoria observed the quiet determination and insight he brought to the table, recognizing that their collaboration could extend far beyond this initial meeting. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. And as they walked back toward the headquarters, a subtle bond had formed, one based on respect, trust, and the understanding that small acts of kindness could grow into meaningful change for many people, and for both of their lives. Ethan Miller stepped into the community center with a mixture of anticipation and quiet apprehension, the polished floors reflecting the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The space was buzzing with activity, volunteers moving tables, sorting supplies, and setting up stations for outreach programs. Ethan adjusted his shirt, smoothing the wrinkles caused by the long walk from his taxi, and glanced around, taking in the sight of people from all walks of life coming together in a single purpose. Victoria Hale followed him closely, carrying a tablet with notes and plans, her presence calm and encouraging, as if to reassure him that he belonged here. Ethan was introduced to several staff members, who welcomed him with polite nods and brief handshakes, curiosity flickering in their eyes at the idea that a taxi driver would now be participating in the design of a company-led initiative. Victoria explained that he would be observing the daily routines, collecting feedback, and eventually helping to develop strategies to support drivers who often worked long hours in challenging conditions. As Ethan began walking through the stations, he observed a driver struggling to complete paperwork for reimbursement and immediately stepped forward, offering practical advice based on his own experiences. Victoria watched from a short distance, noting the way his suggestions were met with relief and appreciation, and she could not help but smile at how effortlessly he connected with people despite the unfamiliar environment. During a break, Ethan sat at a table with a few employees, listening to their stories, learning about the obstacles they faced, and offering empathy and encouragement where appropriate. He realized that his experiences navigating the city streets were more valuable than he had imagined, and that understanding their daily challenges gave him a perspective that was both authentic and insightful. Victoria approached and handed him a cup of tea, the steam curling gently in the sunlight, and she asked for his observations. Ethan shared his thoughts on improving communication, scheduling, and support mechanisms, and the team quickly began noting these ideas, integrating them into the ongoing discussion for the initiative. As the afternoon progressed, the tasks became more interactive, and Ethan led a small group through a scenario planning exercise, guiding them on how to handle unexpected challenges while maintaining compassion and fairness. He found himself speaking with confidence, drawing from his own life experiences, and noticing how the participants responded positively, their faces lighting up with understanding and hope. Victoria stood nearby, occasionally offering gentle guidance, and she felt a growing respect for the way he inspired those around him, bridging the gap between management and field work in a way that no executive meeting could achieve alone. As the day came to a close, Ethan and Victoria walked through the center, reviewing the notes, feedback, and plans for the next steps. The sunlight had shifted, casting long, warm beams through the windows, highlighting the smiles on faces that had benefited from the afternoon's efforts. Victoria turned to him and said, "Your insight today was invaluable. You not only observed, but truly understood their challenges, and that perspective is exactly what we need." Ethan felt a swell of pride, mixed with humility, realizing that his life experiences, his small act of kindness, and his willingness to help without expectation had brought him to a place where he could make a real difference. The quiet satisfaction that settled over him was unlike anything he had felt before, a confirmation that the paths of their two very different lives were now connected in a way that promised growth, understanding, and perhaps something deeper yet to unfold. They left the center. Together, the streets outside alive with the evening rush. Yet within the space between them, a bond had formed, shaped by shared purpose, empathy, and the unfolding trust that would continue to guide their journey. The next morning, Ethan Miller woke to the familiar sound of the city stirring outside his window, the faint rumble of distant traffic and the occasional honk of a horn blending with the soft chirping of birds perched on nearby trees. He stretched his arms, feeling the residual tension in his shoulders from the previous day's experiences, yet there was a strange sense of anticipation threading through him, a recognition that the world had subtly shifted. As he prepared for his shift, arranging his few personal belongings and checking the taxi for any minor maintenance issues, his mind wandered to Victoria Hale and the project they had begun collaborating on. The thought of her guidance and the faith she had placed in him stirred both pride and a lingering anxiety, as he was aware that any misstep could compromise the trust she had extended. Driving through the morning streets, he noted the familiar rhythm of pedestrians, cyclists, and fellow drivers. Yet each observation now carried an added layer of meaning, as he considered how his insights could shape the community initiative. Across town, Victoria entered the office with a purposeful stride, the polished floors gleaming under the mid-morning sunlight, and her assistant, Daniel, handed her the latest reports from the project team. A few of the employees had raised questions regarding Ethan's role, some whispering doubts about his qualifications and suggesting that his inclusion was a gesture of favoritism rather than merit. Victoria felt a slight tightening in her chest as she read through the notes, understanding that perceptions of nepotism or staged appearances could undermine the progress they had worked to achieve. She decided that the matter needed to be addressed directly and called for a brief meeting with Ethan to clarify the situation and ensure that the focus remained on the project goals rather than speculation. When Ethan arrived at the office, he was greeted by the quiet tension of the conference room, the air charged with curiosity and the subtle undercurrent of skepticism from a few team members. Victoria motioned for him to sit and began by acknowledging the concerns, explaining firmly that his participation was based on the unique perspective and first-hand experience he brought to the table, not on patronage or image. Ethan listened, his initial discomfort giving way to a measured understanding, and he explained how his observations and interactions from the field could provide practical solutions to challenges that the team might otherwise overlook. The conversation shifted naturally into a collaborative discussion, with Victoria facilitating input from both Ethan and the team, demonstrating that his insights were valuable and applicable. Slowly, the initial tension eased as colleagues saw the substance of his contributions, and the room began to engage with the ideas he presented. By mid-afternoon, Ethan was leading a breakout session, guiding a small group through problem-solving exercises and practical demonstrations of support measures for drivers, while Victoria observed, offering encouragement and occasional guidance. She could see the transformation in him, from a man tentative in the executive environment to someone commanding respect through knowledge and empathy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office as the sessions concluded, and Victoria invited Ethan to step outside onto the terrace. The city skyline stretched before them in a panorama of glass and steel. She smiled and said, "Today you have shown them exactly why your voice matters. Your integrity and understanding have proven that meaningful contribution is not dictated by title or experience alone, but by perspective and action." Ethan felt a warm sense of accomplishment mixed with humility, realizing that the previous doubts and misgivings had been dispelled through effort and sincerity. As they watched the city below, the hum of traffic and distant conversations creating a subtle soundtrack, Ethan understood that this was more than a project. It was an affirmation that small acts of kindness and observation could ripple outward, earning trust and opening doors to unforeseen opportunities. Victoria's eyes met his, and in that glance, there was an unspoken recognition that the bond they were forming was built on respect, authenticity, and a shared belief in the potential to make a real difference. The city continued to move, people flowing like currents. Yet in that moment, on the terrace high above, the challenges and uncertainties of their different worlds seemed to converge, and Ethan felt a quiet certainty that the paths they had started to walk together would shape not only the success of the project, but the course of their intertwined lives. The evening had settled over the city, painting the skyline in hues of orange and deepening blue, and Ethan Miller found himself walking slowly back to his small apartment after a long day of engaging with the community program. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the afternoon replaced by the distant hum of late traffic and the occasional chatter of pedestrians heading home. Ethan's mind was occupied with reflection, replaying the moments of the day when his suggestions had been met with nods of approval, when his perspective had influenced practical solutions, and when he realized that his voice had value beyond the cab he drove. The glow of streetlights flickered across the wet pavement from a brief drizzle that had passed earlier, adding a soft shine to the asphalt, and the familiar route home felt different, infused with the subtle awareness that his life was shifting in unexpected ways. Across town, Victoria Hale remained in her office, reviewing the day's notes and progress reports, her desk illuminated by the warm glow of her desk lamp and the fading sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She thought about Ethan, about the way he had handled himself with patience, empathy, and authenticity, and how the employees who had been skeptical at first were beginning to trust and respect him. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on how unusual it was for someone so unpolished by corporate life to command such influence, and yet it was precisely that quality she admired most. Later, Ethan settled into his modest living space, the soft hum of his old refrigerator and the occasional distant siren outside, providing a quiet backdrop to his thoughts. He made himself a simple dinner and sat at the small table, the evening cityscape visible through the window behind him, lights twinkling like distant stars. He considered the bridge between his world and Victoria's, between the streets he knew intimately and the corporate corridors she navigated with ease, and he realized that the act of letting her into his life had set a series of events in motion that neither of them could have predicted. Victoria, on the other hand, prepared a brief email to her team summarizing the outcomes of the day, highlighting Ethan's contributions and emphasizing the importance of listening to voices that often went unheard. She paused, staring out the window at the skyline, thinking about how a single ride in the rain had led her to discover qualities in Ethan that she valued far beyond professional expertise. As night deepened, Ethan reflected on the subtle changes within himself, the confidence he had gained, and the respect he had begun to earn from those around him. He thought about Victoria, about her warmth and her insistence that he understood the needs of the people they were serving, and he felt a mixture of gratitude and quiet wonder at the unusual friendship and mentorship that was developing. The city outside continued its steady rhythm, lights flickering on as buildings awakened for the evening, and Ethan felt the beginnings of a deeper understanding, a realization that his life and Victoria's were now intertwined through shared purpose and mutual respect. Sitting back in his chair, He allowed himself to imagine the possibilities ahead, knowing that while the streets he drove every day were familiar, the journey he had begun with Victoria was entirely new, full of potential, challenges, and perhaps even something more profound that neither of them yet fully comprehended. The night was still and quiet, yet the sense of anticipation lingered in the air, a promise that the paths they were forging together would continue to shape their lives in ways neither could have predicted, creating a bond strengthened by trust, integrity, and the quiet power of one small act that had set everything into motion. The day of the gallery unveiling arrived with a crisp autumn morning, the sun casting golden light across the streets and glinting off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings. Ethan Miller walked alongside Victoria Hale toward the small art gallery she had arranged to honor the contributions of community members, his steps measured but filled with a quiet anticipation. The streets were bustling with pedestrians, and the scent of coffee and baked goods wafted from nearby cafes, adding a comforting backdrop to the day's event. As they approached the gallery entrance, Victoria smiled at Ethan and said, "Today is not just about recognition. It is about celebrating the ripple effect of kindness, and your role in that cannot be overstated." Ethan felt a surge of pride mixed with nervousness, aware that the space would soon be filled with people who had no idea of the journey that had led him here. The gallery doors opened, and a soft murmur of conversation drifted toward them, the walls, lined with framed sketches, photographs, and paintings depicting moments of compassion, perseverance, and community connection. Ethan's own contributions were displayed prominently, a small collection of sketches he had made during his downtime, inspired by his observations and interactions with drivers and employees over the past weeks. Visitors began to arrive, their eyes scanning the walls, pausing to admire the art, reading the captions that told the stories behind each piece. Ethan walked through the gallery, feeling a mixture of humility and astonishment, noticing how people responded to his sketches, the way they lingered on certain details, and how they smiled or nodded in recognition of the emotions captured within each piece. Victoria stood beside him, offering subtle encouragement and introductions to guests, her presence both grounding and supportive. As the gallery filled, Ethan found himself speaking with attendees, explaining the inspiration behind the sketches, the small moments of kindness that had sparked each image, and how those moments had motivated him to engage more deeply with the community initiative. The crowd listened attentively, and he felt a profound sense of connection, realizing that his experiences, once confined to the city streets, were now resonating with a broader audience in meaningful ways. Midway through the event, Victoria guided Ethan to the center of the gallery, where a spotlight illuminated his most significant piece, a detailed sketch of a rainy night scene in which a taxi driver offered a ride to a shivering stranger, the moment that had sparked their collaboration. She addressed the guests, explaining the story behind the artwork, the impact of small acts of generosity, and the importance of recognizing those who often go unnoticed. Ethan stood beside her, the warmth of the moment filling him with a mix of disbelief and gratitude, as the audience responded with applause and appreciative murmurs. The combination of visual storytelling and personal narrative created a palpable energy in the room, and Ethan felt that the gallery was not just celebrating art, but also honoring the principles of empathy and compassion that had guided their journey. As the event continued, Victoria and Ethan moved through the crowd together, engaging with guests, sharing insights, and reflecting on the experiences that had led to this moment. Ethan realized that the day symbolized more than recognition. It represented a turning point, the culmination of his efforts, and a validation of his dedication to helping others without expectation. By the time the gallery began to quiet down, the sun had lowered in the sky, casting long golden shadows through the windows. Victoria turned to Ethan and said softly, "You have inspired everyone here, and you have inspired me. It is clear that your kindness, perspective, and willingness to act have made a lasting difference." Ethan smiled, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment, understanding that the gallery, the project, and their collaboration were only the beginning of a journey that would continue to shape both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated. The evening air was crisp and calm as they stepped outside, the city lights beginning to twinkle, and Ethan felt a quiet certainty that the bond formed through shared purpose, trust, and acts of kindness would endure, guiding the next steps of their intertwined paths. The gallery lights had dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the remaining spotlights, highlighting the sketches and photographs along the walls, and Ethan Miller stood beside Victoria Hale, taking in the quiet aftermath of the event. Guests had departed, leaving a sense of calm and accomplishment in the space, and the subtle hum of the city outside seeped through the large windows, mixing with the faint echo of footsteps and laughter from earlier. Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment, the culmination of weeks of effort, small acts of kindness, and collaboration now solidified into something tangible and recognized. Victoria turned toward him, her eyes reflecting both pride and warmth, and she said, "Ethan, today was more than just a gallery or a project. It was a testament to what compassion, integrity, and initiative can achieve. I cannot imagine having undertaken this journey without your insight and courage." Ethan's chest tightened, and he swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him, mingling with relief and gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen, not as a taxi driver, not as someone struggling to make ends meet, but as a person capable of impact, capable of inspiring others. He nodded quietly, his voice catching slightly as he replied, "Thank you, Victoria. I could not have imagined that one small decision would lead to all of this. Yet standing here, seeing the difference we have made together, I understand how meaningful it can be to act with care, even in the smallest ways." Victoria smiled and reached out, lightly touching his arm, a gesture of connection that felt natural and sincere, bridging the worlds they had come from and now shared. Outside the gallery, the evening air was crisp, carrying the scents of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of street food, and they walked together toward the taxi that had been parked nearby for the day. Ethan opened the door for her first, the action simple yet emblematic of the trust and mutual respect that had grown between them. As they drove through the city streets, the traffic lights casting long reflections on the wet pavement from a brief drizzle earlier in the evening, Victoria spoke of future plans for the initiative, emphasizing collaboration, ongoing engagement, and the importance of continuing to recognize and support those who often went unnoticed. Ethan listened attentively, offering suggestions, reflecting on his experiences, and feeling a growing sense of confidence and purpose with each word exchanged. They arrived at a small park along the route home, the lights from the surrounding streets casting gentle illumination over the benches and trees, and they decided to pause for a moment, stepping out of the cab to take in the calm of the night. Victoria looked at Ethan, her expression thoughtful, and said, "I hope you understand that your contributions here, and the person you are, mean more than I can express. You have transformed not only the project, but also the way I see leadership and impact." Ethan felt a warmth spreading through him, a mixture of pride, humility, and an unspoken affection that had grown quietly over the course of their journey. He smiled, responding simply, "Victoria, I never expected to find someone who would see me for who I truly am, and who would allow me to be part of something greater than myself." In that quiet moment, the city around them continued its steady rhythm, yet the space between them felt suspended, intimate, and promising. Victoria extended her hand, and Ethan took it, a gesture that symbolized not only their shared success and mutual respect, but also the beginning of a deeper, personal connection. They returned to the cab, the warm interior a contrast to the cool night air, and as they drove toward the familiar streets of the city, Ethan realized that their paths, once separate and defined by circumstance, were now irrevocably intertwined. The ride was quiet, comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding, and the city lights reflected in the windshield seemed to shine brighter, as if acknowledging the journey that had led them here. By the time they reached the end of the route, both understood that their story had reached a meaningful conclusion, a chapter defined by kindness, trust, collaboration, and the possibility of a shared future, each carrying forward the certainty that even the smallest acts can change lives in ways that endure.